Peter Stewart Ney, Schoolmaster and Marshal Ney Impersonator, circa 1769 to 1846. One winter day in the 1830s, in a small town in western North Carolina, a young man saw the schoolmaster who had been boarding with his family collapse out in the snow. The old teacher had a habit of occasionally drinking too much. Hurrying out with a couple of his slaves and a horse, the young man had his slaves load the teacher across the back of the horse. This action aroused the boarder from his drunken slumber and provoked an angry response as he lashed out and hit one of the slaves while crying out, "What? Put the Duke of Elshingen on a horse like a sack? Let me down." When he got down, the teacher, Peter Stewart Ney, paced over to a fence where he leaned over and quietly wept for a couple of moments, presumably furious about the indignity of the moment. One of the slaves interrupted his repose by asking him if he could ride, to which the teacher replied, "Yes, I could ride in the battle." He then mounted and rode with an erect, dignified posture back to the house. When the young man told his father about the strange comments, the elder Houston said that the Duke of Elshingen was a title once held by the famed Marshal Michel Ney. Out of tact, neither father nor son ever asked the teacher if he was indeed the famous French general. For nearly 30 years, a man calling himself Ney, who bore a resemblance to Napoleon's Marshal Michel Ney, worked as a widely admired schoolteacher across 3 states in the American South. He often regaled his listeners with vivid and detailed stories of the Napoleonic Wars, delivered in a faintly Scottish accent. He rarely, if ever, disclosed his identity to new acquaintances, but once he was comfortable with someone and had downed more wine or brandy than was his custom, he would typically reveal himself to be the genuine Marshal Ney. Although he left behind no written account of his life, P.S. Ney left a strong enough impression on those who knew him that his life has generated 4 entire books full of surviving scraps of writing and recollections by Ney's contemporaries and their children, who related stories about him to interviewers. Here, we will examine the story that P.S. Ney spread about his escape from the firing squad in December 1815, his activities in the United States, whether or not his story bears up to scrutiny, and what motives could impel someone to impersonate one of Napoleon's marshals in the United States, where the finer points of the Napoleonic Wars were only known by a small handful of educated people. For the sake of convenience, and because the irony is too delicious to pass on, those who believe in the truth of P.S. Ney's claims will henceforth be referred to as naysayers, while those who object will be called critics. I don't make the rules. Wait, actually I do, at least in the telling of this tale. The story goes that Marshal Michel Ney, having betrayed Louis XVIII to help reinstall Napoleon on the throne, was sentenced to be executed. His defenders pointed out that he was France's greatest soldier, having fought in over 500 battles between his enlistment as a hussar in 1787 and his last performance at Waterloo in 1815. So far, so historical. His execution was deeply unpopular at the time, and most historians today think that it was a political misstep by the restored Bourbon monarchy to execute such a popular and beloved figure. Now back to the naysayers' account of affairs. A number of sympathetic persons, including the Duke of Wellington, used their Masonic contacts to have someone take Ney's place before the firing squad. Once spirited away from his executioners, Ney agreed that he had to keep his survival a secret, lest he should endanger Wellington and the other fine gentlemen who had risked it all to save him. In the waning days of 1815, a disguised Ney joined Pascal Luciani and General Count Charles Lefebvre-Desnouttes as they boarded a boat bound for the United States. Using fake names, the trio crossed the Atlantic. Ney once ventured out on deck, but being recognized by a veteran, decided to spend the rest of the journey below deck. Parting with his fellow travelers in Philadelphia, Ney then set sail for Charleston. Naysayers assume that Ney was in contact with these 2 men, in spite of the lack of surviving documentary evidence. The Count joined the numerous Napoleonic veterans who settled in Alabama, which was then a frontier area with a lot of good farmland available. Sadly, when he chose to return to France in 1822, he died because of a shipwreck. Thus, France was deprived of one of its legends, and Ney was deprived of someone who could verify his story. Why did Ney not accompany the Count and go to an area where he would be recognized, protected, and beloved? Obviously, because he could not risk being recognized, and was so concerned with maintaining a secret identity. Luciani also settled in Alabama, but then gave up on the frontier life, as did most of the French officers who settled there, and he chose to relocate to Philadelphia. Naysayers think that Luciani's relocation had little to do with the rigors and lack of culture one had to endure on the frontier, and everything to do with the need for the exiled French veterans to maintain a secret intelligence network. Once again, we are told to believe that the absence of evidence when it comes to correspondence between Ney and Luciani is not evidence of absence. They were just careful about their correspondence, using fake names, some code, or being disciplined about burning things that were incriminating. As for Ney, his dedication to secrecy and avoiding detection extended so far that his new identity utilized the same exact surname that he had made world famous. So much for Luciani and Lefebvre-Desnouts. Having bid farewell to his fellow Frenchmen in Philadelphia, Ney proceeded to Charleston, this time spending the entire voyage below decks lest he be detected again. Upon his arrival in Charleston in early 1816, Ney registered his name as Peter Stewart Ney. The first thing that P.S. Ney did upon his arrival was to visit a music store and purchase a flute. Naysayers point out that the marshal played a flute while in his cell awaiting execution. Not long after his arrival, he put most of his possessions into storage and traveled north to explore the American frontier. Crossing the Ohio River, Ney entered what would become the state of Indiana by the end of his first year in America. While here, he claims that he spent a season as a trapper. Further, he may have settled in the town of Salem, as there was a biography about Napoleon published in the town in 1818, which happened to be the last year of Ney's residency in Indiana. The author is named only as a citizen of the United States. Given the low population density of early Indiana, P.S. Ney's probable presence, and definite interest in the subject, he is most likely the author of this biographical treatment of the French emperor. Returning to South Carolina, Ney reclaimed his possessions from storage in Charleston. He was angered that his army compass had been pilfered from the case, as he had hoped he would be able to put it to good use as a land surveyor. Rather than acquiring another compass and going back to the frontier to survey land, as he had originally intended, Ney decided instead that he should seek another career path. Ultimately, he resolved to become a schoolmaster. One biographer, J.E. Smoot, a confirmed believer in P.S. Ney's Neyness, believes that this was due to his desire to have a career, but to avoid playing a subordinate role after having been such a great and powerful man. Although he had a general education, he felt that he owed it to his students to bone up on some of the more advanced subjects, so P.S. Ney devoted himself for a few years to improving his knowledge of many of the subjects that he intended to teach. Given the limitations of our knowledge of P.S. Ney, the best reconciliation of Ney's claims would be to assume that he was improving his academic preparation while he was out west, since he first applied to teach in 1818. The historical Marshal Ney grew up in Saarlouis, in what is now part of Germany, which meant that he enjoyed native fluency in German comparable to his native fluency in French. He was not known to be an English speaker. The second son of a cooper, Ney's father was evidently better than most at his profession, as Ney was able to attend college. After leaving school in 1782, he became a clerk. Thus, Ney did have some education. However, after a couple years in civil service, boredom set in, and the restless young man enlisted in a hussar regiment, where he was initially restricted from attaining an officer's rank due to his lack of any noble blood. With the coming of the French Revolution, the rank restriction was lifted, and Ney rose to prominence, mostly as a cavalryman. Later, he would command a mostly infantry corps, and he probably had some limited experience with the artillery. The Marshal was known as the bravest of the brave due to his ability to lead and inspire men. While he does not seem to have been a particularly clever strategist or tactician, that does not really tell us anything about his academic abilities, since plenty of generals have had a general intellectual ability much at odds with their battlefield performance. Davout, arguably Napoleon's best and most brilliant marshal, was in fact only slightly above average in the classroom, and then only in the areas of math and philosophy. Naysayers insist that Ney was highly intelligent, and on that point they might be correct, although it does seem that they are merely guessing at the end of the day. P.S. Ney, the teacher, was able to instruct students in Greek and Latin, hence requiring that he must have had a classical education. Given the Marshal's known experiences, he may have had some elementary schooling in both languages at an early age, and he may have picked up some mathematical skills during his education and service in the army. However, it is unlikely that he was able to maintain, much less further develop those skills to any considerable degree given the breakneck pace of his military career from 1787 to 1815. Anyone who has studied languages knows that languages are far easier to learn when one is young. Even young adults starting a new language are unlikely to attain much fluency. Napoleon, whose native language was Italian, always spoke French with a heavy accent. One has to doubt that P.S. Ney was able to thoroughly master Greek and Latin in his spare time in the U.S. at a time when he was just shy of 50 years old. That being said, this part of the story is not impossible and is far more plausible than most of the claims advanced by the naysayers. Settling in Charleston, South Carolina from 1818 to 1821, Ney presented himself as a French refugee who had left for political reasons, and he said that he was seeking employment as a teacher. During this time, Ney was still physically vigorous, and he seems to have found desultory work as a teacher over the next few years. Students and peers alike were very impressed by Ney's skill on a horse and his facility with a sword. At a military review in Columbia, South Carolina, Ney rode so well that some of the onlookers were convinced that he must be the marshal. Ney taught some of the young men in the area to fence and use a broadsword, claiming that he had trained himself to behead enemies with a single blade stroke while he was riding. Ney displayed his scars, including one on the left side of his head, and he frequently complained of an old wound on his thigh. When asked, he told others that all of his scars were from war. In conversations, Ney could speak of war expertly, and his listeners were always very impressed both by his knowledge and how he was able to explain things in such a clear and concise fashion. One of his students, the future Colonel Rogers, engaged him in a heated conversation about the issue of the day, the tariff. Ney, as was his way, only expressed his opinion when asked, and always got straight to the point. "Oh, Jean, the tariff won't hurt you. It's the black spot that is going to ruin you." By black spot, he was referring, of course, to slavery. This forthright, clear, and concise analysis led Rogers to believe in his later years that he must have indeed been conversing with the renowned commander. Colonel John A. Rogers related his memories of Ney to Reverend J. A. Weston, a P.S. Ney investigator in 1888, including a very detailed physical description of P.S. Ney as he appeared around 1820. Weston would continue to see Ney over the next several years as he would revisit the area to meet with old friends. A tall man with reddish blonde hair, beginning to bald, and a muscular physique, erect, with shoulders that were beginning to round a bit, he looked very soldierly, and would continue to do so for many years thereafter. In an age when dental health was not a given, Ney had excellent teeth, and Rogers said that he was always impressed by how well Ney could chew nuts. Ney had dark blue, possibly gray eyes which could become very intense when he was angered, although he was generally reserved, composed, and gentle. Rogers says that Ney's English was excellent, but that his accent sounded more Scottish than French. Rogers said that aside from a tendency to occasionally drink too much wine, Ney had no vices. About 6 months or so before he moved to North Carolina, Ney was teaching class when news arrived that Napoleon had died in exile at St. Helena. Becoming emotional, Ney called off class and disappeared into his room, where he burned all of his papers and a bust of Napoleon. When Ney failed to show up the next morning, Roger's father and a local physician arrived to check on him and found that he had attempted suicide by cutting his throat, but that his effort was stymied by the blade breaking during the attempt and becoming lodged. Patching him up, the two men saved his life. Ney justified his action by saying that with Napoleon's death, his own last hope of ever returning home had vanished. In 1822, Ney moved to Moxold Field, an unincorporated part of North Carolina, which would later become the town of Moxville in 1839, itself a part of Davie County, which would form in 1836. At the time of Ney's arrival, Moxold Field had a village and a militia drill ground. The locals would assemble to drill since there was still a danger of raids from nearby Native American tribes. However, these gatherings were often rowdy and usually involved a good deal of alcohol consumption. An Irish immigrant, Dr. Schools, took great offense at someone's comments and had drawn his knife intending to stab the man, but a tall stranger stopped him with an eloquent reproach, saying that it was ungentlemanly to stab an unarmed person. Schools put his knife away and befriended this tall stranger, who turned out to be none other than Peter Stewart Ney. Ney presented himself as a French refugee seeking work as a teacher. Dr. Schools used his local connections to secure suitable employment for Ney, who would work at a few different places around Davie County over the next 10 to 15 years. In 1832, Ney was still working in Moxold Field, specifically 2 miles north of the village, where he boarded with Thomas Foster. That year he received a piece of mail informing him that Napoleon II, the 21-year-old son of Napoleon, had died of pneumonia while in exile. Ney was inconsolable and shut himself off for several days. He told Foster and others that his hopes of ever securing a pardon had died with the son of l'Empereur. Fearing detection more than ever, Ney burned all of his papers and correspondence. It apparently never occurred to him that telling his friends about his fear of detection, his desire for an official pardon, and his close personal relationship with the Bonaparte family might make the discovery of his true identity that much more likely. After a brief stint teaching in Virginia, Ney returned to North Carolina and worked in Iredell County, right next door to Davie County. In Iredell County, he resided in the town of Houstonville, with a family called the Houstons. I'm not making that up. This was the site of his drunken revelation in the snow of his true identity as the Duke of Elshingen. Following these 2 stops, Ney was then offered a teaching post in the town of Unity in Mecklenburg County in 1838, which he duly accepted. Long absorbed by the spread of Charlotte, Unity was a sleepy hamlet at the time. Fortunately for P.S. Ney, a voracious reader, a new college had sprung up and was only a few miles away. Founded in 1837, Davidson College was still establishing itself and its identity. The school still lacked an emblem, and some of the earliest attempts by faculty to create one had failed. Learning that a talented schoolmaster lived nearby, some of the faculty from Davidson visited Ney and asked him for his input. Offhandedly, Ney sketched an emblem on a piece of scrap paper. To this day, Peter Stewart Ney's design remains Davidson's emblem, thus making it one of the few incontrovertible achievements of North Carolina Ney. A frequent visitor to the school, the professors held Ney in high regard and were impressed by how excellent he was as a mathematician. Today, some of his notes, left in very neat ink, are preserved in the college's archives, along with some notes he left in the margins of books. One of the notes that he left was in a book on the Napoleonic Wars, with Ney noting that a portrait of Marshal Ney was a bit inaccurate as it showed Ney with more hair than he actually possessed. Not coincidentally, I'm going to go ahead and guess that P.S. Ney had a little bit less hair than Michel Ney. Despite having made many friends, being a respected member of a number of communities in his adopted state of North Carolina, and being respected by the professors at Davidson College, Ney's days were still coming to a close. As he aged, Ney relieved his aches and pains by visiting Catawba Mineral Springs in nearby Lincoln County. He often borrowed books and occasionally wrote in the margins there as well. His fans all say that the man had no vices, but I would count writing in the margins of books as being a bit of a problematic behavior. Ney remained mentally sharp, but he also remained troubled by the performance of Marshal Ney at Waterloo. Any criticism of the late Emperor Napoleon would also draw his ire. He opined that the conduct of Marshal Grouchy during the Waterloo campaign was nothing short of treasonous due to the extent of the incompetence that man displayed. With his health failing, Ney spent his final days in the home of a friend in Rowan County, where he was attended by a former student, Dr. Matthew Locke. Locke asked him to proclaim his true identity before it was too late, at which the now 77-year-old teacher dramatically rose to an erect posture and proclaimed, "I am Marshal Ney of France." He then told the homeowner that he had deposited a manuscript relating the full and true story of his life in the owner's desk. After he passed away, within hours of this proclamation, the men attending him found the manuscript, and they all read it. When his followers handed the manuscript over for translation, it went missing and has not been seen since. The date of P.S. Ney's death was November 15th, 1846. One, I think, can safely surmise from the foregoing story that the escapades of one Joseph Smith were well known to educated men in North Carolina. In his later days, Ney received a few visits from a man called Dr. Neyman of Indiana. Neyman claimed that P.S. Ney had slain a panther near a cave in Saltillo, Indiana, during a sojourn on the frontier right after his arrival in the United States. When Ney died in 1846, Dr. Neyman claimed to be his son, born in France and having escaped to the U.S. Ignoring the fact that all four of Ney's sons lived and died in Europe, Dr. Neyman claimed that his father had given him many of his documents back in 1837. Later, in 1876, Dr. Neyman purchased the cave in Saltillo, Indiana, and then visited Ney's burial site, requesting permission to relocate his father's remains to the cave. Church officials, skeptical of his story and his claim to be Ney's son, denied his request and sent him home empty-handed. Outside of specific incidents which can be dated, naysayers cite the behaviors and habits of Peter Stewart Ney to show that he must have been the real McCoy. He could tell vivid stories of battle, replete with lots of detail about Napoleon and Marshal Ney. Often sleepless, Ney tended to burn the midnight oil and write for hours, supposedly hard at work composing what he hoped would be the definitive account of the Napoleonic Wars. He did this in the hopes that he would be able to publish all of this upon his return from exile. No one ever saw or read these works because he burned all of his papers every time he received bad news from France. Ney chose to reside in the Piedmont area of North Carolina because that particular geographical region would afford him both access to news from France and the ability to evade any agent seeking him out, as he could flee to the nearby Blue Ridge Mountains. One time, his students sought to impress him by erecting a small sign reading P.S. Ney's Academy, which he hurriedly removed, stating that he did not wish for such exposure. Naysayers also cite as evidence an anecdote that one of the marshal's sons angrily reproached Wellington and demanded to have a question answered. At the end of the interview, the younger Ney was satisfied with the Duke's answer. This could only mean, of course, that the younger Ney was demanding to know what had happened to his father, and that Wellington assured him that he had acted honorably as a Freemason, and made sure that the legendary campaigner had made it to North Carolina, where he was teaching grammar and geography. Perhaps the strongest evidence that naysayers have produced is that the handwriting of the teacher and the marshal are very similar, but handwriting analysis is, of course, very subjective and contentious. Peter Stewart Ney's story is a uniquely American one, and it is one of the many folklore tales that have become a part of North Carolina history. Not shockingly, however, some French researchers have taken an interest in this wild story. Although Marshal Ney's line died out with his 4 sons, and there are no living Neys demanding the truth, it would still make international news if this legend from small-town North Carolina could become an established fact in French history. A French team came to the U.S. to compare P.S. Ney's DNA to that of the Marshal. While they were not able to find anything useful in his grave during their 2022 visit, they did examine his flute, which had ended up in the archives at Davidson College. Much to the surprise of the naysayers, the DNA was not a match. While I'm sure that someone has an objection to the methodology or an alternative explanation about how the flute may have been contaminated, the odds of recovering a better DNA sample at this late date are as vanishingly small as the Marshal having been spirited away from the firing squad and living on for another 30 years in obscurity. Personally, I don't think that the examination of the DNA was necessary. For starters, one has to accept the premise that the Masons have real influence and are something other than a collection of local small business owners who dress up and share trivial secrets. Even beyond that, one has to consider the behavior of Peter Stewart Ney. Consider the facts. He constantly put himself in position to demonstrate his prowess as a rider and swordsman, used the name Ney, discussed the Napoleonic Wars at length with all and sundry with a focus on Marshal Ney, and confessed that he was that Ney after just a few drinks. In general, he did everything possible to suggest the possibility that he was Marshal Michel Ney, and this shows me that he was hoping to be recognized and accepted as the French Marshal. If he had escaped France and was honor-bound to conceal his identity, then one has to presume that he could have found a better way to keep his identity concealed. Ney was hiding beneath a neon sign in a country where the desires of the last Bourbon monarchs, Louis XVIII and Charles X, were entirely irrelevant. When Charles X was deposed in 1836, Ney still found reasons for not returning to France. He also showed no real interest in contacting his wife or children. Of all the stories where he's recognized, it is either by people who had only glimpsed him at a distance or had never actually seen the Marshal in person. But when they saw Peter Stewart Ney, they saw a man who must be the Marshal because he just seemed so right for the role. If P.S. Ney was not the Marshal, then who might he have been? A number of enthusiasts for the story have come up with explanations. Some think that he was a French veteran, possibly a staff officer, who had suffered greatly during the Napoleonic Wars, and then decided to spend his later years in the United States twirling an imaginary marshal's baton and looking out for royalist agents. Due to reports that Ney had a Scottish accent, a slightly more popular opinion is that he was a Scot who had served in the British Army during the Napoleonic era. Through research, this educated Scot became an ardent admirer of Ney. Perhaps despising the English, as had many Scots for many generations, this veteran decided to embrace the Ney legacy. Proponents of both ideas are open to the idea that P.S. Ney was not quite a grifter, but rather someone who succeeded in convincing himself that he was, indeed, the bravest of the brave. The question that remains for us to answer is why someone would pretend to be a man who was publicly executed on the other side of the Atlantic. J. Edward Smoot, a physician and naysayer from Concord, North Carolina, whose 1929 book on Ney covered both the French Marshal and North Carolina schoolteacher, perhaps inadvertently explained what might have motivated someone to take on the persona of Marshal Michel Ney. As Smoot wrote, "There is perhaps not another name in the military annals that so thrills the hearts of the admirer of heroes as that of Marshal Ney. In other words, Peter Stewart Ney was, at heart, the most dedicated cosplayer of his generation. One could accuse him of stolen valor, but Americans only became uptight about stolen valor after 9/11. He may not have led Napoleon's rear guard in Russia, but Peter Stewart Ney was one hell of a teacher, leaving enough tantalizing tidbits to keep off-duty doctors and local history enthusiasts visiting local archives for nearly 2 centuries. It only seems fair that we allow Peter Stewart Ney to have the final word about himself and his life. On September 20th, 1841, at Catawba Mineral Springs, he wrote in one book, P.S. Ney, an atom floating on an atmosphere of chance.